April 1945. Western Germany. The war is almost over, but the landscape still carries the exhaustion of 6 years of conflict. Burned villages line the roads. Bridges lie twisted in rivers. Columns of refugees move slowly through the countryside, carrying bundles of blankets and what little food they can find. Near a small American field camp, a military truck arrives at the medical tent. 2 soldiers step down and help someone from the back. At first, the medics assume it is another wounded prisoner. But as the figure approaches the tent entrance, they pause. It is a girl. No older than 18. Her uniform hangs loosely from her shoulders. Her steps are slow and uncertain, as if even walking requires enormous effort. Her face is pale, her cheeks hollow. When she sits down on the examination table, the bones of her wrists are sharply visible beneath the skin. A medic lifts her on to Ascale. The needle settles. Liu Shi pounds. Inside the tent, conversation stops. For the medical staff, this is not simply another prisoner. It is a shocking glimpse of what the final months of the war have done to the people trapped inside Germany, and to understand how an 18-year-old could reach such a state. We must first look at the world collapsing around her during the final year of the Third Reich. By the beginning of 1945, Germany was no longer a functioning wartime economy. It was a system in collapse. For much of the war, the Nazi regime had managed to keep civilian food supplies relatively stable compared with earlier conflicts. This was achieved through strict rationing, centralized distribution, and the exploitation of occupied territories across Europe. Grain, livestock, and industrial goods were transported into Germany from conquered regions, helping sustain the German population during the early years of the war, but by 1944, that system was breaking apart. The turning point came as Allied forces began systematically destroying Germany's transportation network. American and British bombers targeted rail yards, bridges, canals, and factories across the Reich. The objective was clear: cripple the infrastructure that allowed Germany to move food, fuel, and equipment across the country. The strategy worked. Railway lines were repeatedly bombed. Locomotives were destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Freight yards lay in ruins. Even when food existed in rural areas, it often could not reach the cities. Meanwhile, German farmland itself was under growing pressure. Millions of agricultural workers had been drafted into the army earlier in the war. Farms increasingly relied on forced laborers brought from occupied territories. As Allied armies advanced and territories were liberated, many of these laborers disappeared or fled. Agricultural production declined sharply. At the same time, Germany's fuel shortages worsened. The Allied bombing campaign targeted synthetic oil plants and refineries that supplied the German military and economy. Without fuel, trucks could not transport food supplies across the country. The effects on civilians became increasingly severe. In major cities such as Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne, ration portions continued shrinking throughout 1944 and early 1945. Official food allowances dropped well, below normal nutritional requirements. Meat became rare. Bread portions were reduced. Coffee had long since disappeared, replaced by substitutes made from roasted grains. Many Germans survived on potatoes and thin vegetable soups. Even these became scarce during the final months of the war. The destruction of urban infrastructure made daily life even harder. Bombing raids left hundreds of thousands of civilians homeless. Water systems failed in damaged neighborhoods. Electricity was unreliable. Families spent nights in crowded shelters while factories and residential districts burned around them. The war was no longer distant. It had entered German homes. As conditions worsened, entire populations began moving across the country. Refugees fled the eastern regions as the Soviet Red Army advanced toward Germany. Millions of civilians crowded trains, wagons, and roads heading west. Food supplies, already strained, had to support these enormous refugee movements. Starvation began appearing in places where it had been almost unknown earlier in the war. Teenagers and young women were particularly vulnerable. By 1944, the Nazi regime had mobilized much of Germany's youth into auxiliary roles supporting the military. Girls and young women worked as communications clerks, radar assistants, or anti-aircraft helpers within the Luftwaffe. Others served in administrative offices connected to the war effort. Many of these young workers lived in barracks or dormitories near military facilities. When supply systems collapsed during the final months of the war, these locations often found themselves isolated. Deliveries stopped arriving. Kitchens ran out of ingredients. Ration cards became nearly meaningless when there was no food left to distribute. The result was a slow, grinding hunger that spread across large parts of Germany. For some individuals, especially those already weakened by illness or displacement, that hunger became something far more dangerous. And by the spring of 1945, when Allied forces began encountering civilians and prisoners inside Germany, American medics were discovering just how severe the situation had become. While Germany's food system was collapsing under bombing, blockade, and military defeat, another system was advancing steadily toward its borders. The Allied Medical Corps. From the beginning of the war, the United States military had invested enormous effort into building a modern battlefield medical network. By 1944, the U.S. Army Medical Department had developed one of the most advanced systems of wartime care ever assembled. It was designed for speed. In combat zones, injured soldiers were first treated by company medics who carried medical kits directly into the battlefield. From there, wounded men were transported to battalion aid stations, where doctors stabilized injuries and prepared patients for evacuation. The next stage involved field hospitals or evacuation hospitals, mobile medical units capable of performing surgery close to the front lines. These hospitals moved as armies advanced, setting up in tents, schools, or captured buildings. Behind them stood larger general hospitals, capable of treating thousands of patients and performing complex surgeries. This entire system operated through an intricate logistical network of ambulances, trucks, aircraft, and medical trains. The goal was simple: keep wounded soldiers alive long enough to reach full medical treatment. But as Allied forces pushed into Western Europe after the Normandy landings in June 1944, the Medical Corps soon faced responsibilities beyond treating their own troops. They began encountering civilians. Across liberated France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, American medical units frequently treated local populations suffering from war injuries, malnutrition, and disease. Hospitals established for soldiers often opened sections for civilians as well. By the time Allied armies crossed into Germany in early 1945, the scale of humanitarian need had grown dramatically. The collapse of German infrastructure meant that civilians were arriving at Allied lines in large numbers. Some were refugees fleeing combat zones. Others were prisoners or forced laborers who had escaped from camps or factories. Many were sick. Some were starving. American medical teams had to adapt quickly to these conditions. Supplies designed for battlefield surgery were now also being used to treat malnutrition, dehydration, and diseases linked to long-term hunger. Doctors began encountering patients whose bodies had been weakened by months, sometimes years of inadequate nutrition. Medical officers recorded cases of severe weight loss, vitamin deficiencies, and muscle wasting among civilians arriving at Allied camps. Some patients were so weak they could barely walk. For medics trained primarily to treat wounds caused by bullets and artillery, this type of suffering required a different kind of response. Treatment began with stabilization. Patients suffering from extreme malnutrition could not immediately consume large quantities of food. Doctors had learned from earlier humanitarian crises that starving individuals required gradual refeeding. Too much food too quickly could cause dangerous complications. So recovery began slowly. Small portions of soup, carefully measured bread, gradual increases in calories over days or weeks. Fluids were often administered first to treat dehydration. The work was meticulous and patient. American medical personnel were also documenting what they saw. Reports written by field doctors described the conditions encountered among civilians in Germany during the final months of the war. Many of these reports emphasized how rapidly living standards had deteriorated in regions cut off from reliable food supplies. These records would later become part of the historical evidence describing the humanitarian crisis that accompanied the collapse of the Third Reich. for the medics working in those tents and field hospitals. However, these events were not abstract statistics. They were human encounters. Individuals arriving at camp gates, prisoners carried in on stretchers, teenagers so weak they could barely stand, and occasionally, someone whose condition was so severe that even experienced doctors stopped in silence when the scale revealed the truth. It was in one such moment, during the spring of 1945, that the arrival of a young German prisoner would leave a lasting impression on the American medical staff examining her. From that moment, several perspectives begin to emerge: the lives of young women in the collapsing Reich, the reality of starvation in wartime Germany, and the medical response of the Allied forces who encountered them. By the final years of the war, Germany was relying heavily on its youngest citizens. Millions of adult men were already serving at the front. Casualties had mounted across years of fighting in the Soviet Union, North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe. As the war expanded, the German state increasingly turned to teenagers and young women to fill critical support roles behind the lines. These young women became part of a system known as the Helferinnen, or auxiliaries. They worked in communication centers, operating switchboards that connected military headquarters. Some assisted radar stations that tracked incoming Allied bombers. Others served as clerks, radio operators, or administrative staff within the Luftwaffe and the Army. Many were still teenagers. 18 was a common age for these assignments. For many of them, the war had shaped nearly their entire adolescence. They had grown up during the rise of the Third Reich. Schools, youth organizations, and public media had emphasized loyalty to the state and sacrifice for the nation. Service in auxiliary roles was presented as patriotic duty. These positions were not intended to place young women in direct combat. But as Allied armies moved deeper into German territory during 1944 and 1945, the distinction between frontline and rear area began to disappear. Cities once considered safe suddenly lay within range of artillery or air attack. Military offices relocated repeatedly to avoid bombing raids. Communication centers were often set up in temporary buildings or underground shelters. Young women working in these facilities lived under the same conditions as soldiers' constant alarms, shortages of food, and growing uncertainty about the future. When the supply network collapsed during the final months of the war, these auxiliary workers often suffered alongside the civilians around them. Their rations shrank. Deliveries stopped arriving. Barracks kitchens ran out of ingredients. For young women already living under stress and exhaustion, the effects of hunger could be devastating. And by the spring of 1945, the broader food crisis inside Germany had reached a point where survival itself was becoming uncertain for many people. Starvation rarely arrives suddenly. It grows gradually. In Germany, during the last year of the war, the process began with shortages that seemed manageable at first. Ration cards were adjusted. Portions became smaller. Substitute ingredients replaced foods that could no longer be imported or transported. Bread contained increasing amounts of filler grains. Coffee was replaced with roasted barley. Butter and meat became rare. By late 1944, many urban families were already supplementing their rations by searching for food in rural areas or trading possessions on the black market. But the collapse accelerated during the final months of the war. Railways no longer functioned reliably. Trucks lacked fuel. Farms struggled to deliver harvests to cities. As refugees poured into Western Germany from the Eastern Front, the number of mouths to feed increased dramatically. In some regions, official rations fell far below the minimum calories required for basic health. Young people were especially vulnerable. Teenagers required more calories for growth and physical development, yet they often received the same reduced rations as adults. Those working long hours in military offices or auxiliary facilities burned energy faster than they could replace it. Malnutrition began to appear. Weight loss became common. Clothing hung loosely from bodies that had grown thinner week by week. For individuals already weakened by illness or prolonged stress, the situation could become life-threatening. Doctors later studying the final months of the war documented cases of extreme emaciation among civilians and auxiliary workers in areas cut off from reliable food supplies. By the time Allied forces entered Germany in early 1945, these hidden humanitarian crises were beginning to appear in full view. And for American medical teams encountering the survivors of this collapsing system, the sight could be deeply unsettling. Because sometimes the physical evidence of starvation was so severe that it stunned even experienced doctors. By 1945, American military medics had already treated thousands of casualties across multiple campaigns. They had worked in North Africa under desert heat. They had operated in field hospitals in Italy during long mountain battles. They had treated wounded soldiers during the brutal fighting in Normandy and the push across France. They were familiar with the destruction war could cause: gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, burns from explosions. These were the injuries they expected. But starvation presented a very different challenge. When American medical units entered Germany in the final months of the war, they began encountering civilians and prisoners suffering from extreme malnutrition. Some had been trapped in cities where food deliveries had stopped. Others had spent months living on shrinking rations inside collapsing military facilities. For doctors trained to repair battlefield injuries, these cases required a different kind of medicine. Malnutrition changes the body slowly. Muscle tissue disappears first. Fat reserves vanish. The immune system weakens. Skin becomes thin. Bones become visible. Even basic movement requires enormous effort. The medics working in Allied field hospitals were forced to adapt quickly. Treatment required patience and careful monitoring. Starving patients could not simply be given large meals. Instead, doctors introduced food gradually. Small portions of soup, bread in controlled amounts, water to treat dehydration. It was a delicate process, one that required attention not just to survival, but to recovery. And sometimes the severity of what they encountered left even experienced medical personnel momentarily silent. Military doctors were trained to remain calm under pressure, but there were moments during the final months of the war when even professionals were surprised by what they saw. The arrival of severely malnourished individuals at Allied camps was one of those moments. When a patient was placed on a scale, the numbers sometimes revealed the true extent of suffering caused by months of starvation. A healthy 18-year-old woman would normally weigh more than twice what some of these patients weighed when they arrived. For medics, the numbers were more than statistics. They were indicators of how close a body was to complete physical collapse. Extreme malnutrition could damage organs, weaken the heart, and make even simple infections life-threatening. In cases where weight had dropped dangerously low, every hour of treatment mattered. Doctors worked carefully. Fluids were administered. Vital signs were monitored. Food was introduced slowly to avoid overwhelming a weakened system. But beyond the clinical procedures, there was also a human reaction. Many medics realized they were witnessing the physical consequences of the war on civilians, who had little control over the system they had grown up inside. For soldiers who had spent years fighting against Germany's military power, these encounters revealed a different reality. One where the collapse of a regime left ordinary people struggling simply to survive. Throughout the war, Nazi propaganda had warned German citizens about the dangers of surrendering to Allied forces. The enemy was portrayed as cruel and vindictive. But inside American medical tents, that narrative began to unravel. Prisoners and civilians arriving at Allied camps were treated according to medical need. Doctors focused on stabilizing patients, not punishing them. For those who had grown up hearing that the enemy would show no mercy, the experience could be confusing. The soldiers and medics they encountered behaved not like the monsters described in propaganda, but like professionals performing their duties. This contrast carried enormous psychological weight. The war had been framed as a struggle between enemies incapable of coexistence. Yet inside those medical tents, the immediate priority was not ideology. It was survival. And soon, in the decisive moment, when the young prisoner's condition was fully revealed, the consequences of Germany's collapse would become impossible to ignore. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final and most chaotic phase. German military resistance was disintegrating on multiple fronts. In the east, the Soviet Red Army was pushing relentlessly toward Berlin. capturing one city after another across Poland and eastern Germany. Entire German divisions had been destroyed in massive offensives during the winter of 1945. In the west, American, British, and Canadian forces were advancing just as quickly. After crossing the Rhine River in March 1945, Allied armies poured into the industrial heartland of Western Germany. Cities that had once been important centers of German industry, Cologne, Bonn, and Essen, fell in rapid succession. The German command structure was collapsing. Communications broke down. Orders arrived late or not at all. Entire units were cut off from supply lines and forced to surrender as Allied armored columns swept past them. One of the most dramatic events occurred in April 1945 with the encirclement of the Ruhr Pocket. This region, once the industrial engine of the German war effort, was surrounded by American forces. Inside the pocket were hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, along with large civilian populations. With no realistic possibility of escape or resupply, German commanders began surrendering their forces. More than 300,000 German troops would eventually be captured in this single encirclement. But soldiers were not the only people encountered by Allied forces during this advance. As the front lines moved deeper into Germany, American units began encountering civilians emerging from bombed cities, abandoned factories, and refugee columns moving westward. Some had been forced laborers brought into Germany from occupied countries. Others were German civilians who had lost their homes in bombing raids. And among them were young auxiliary workers, teenagers, and young women who had served in communications offices, radar stations, and administrative centers supporting the German military. Many of these individuals had been living in facilities that depended on the same collapsing supply network as the rest of Germany. When Allied armies reached these areas, the people they encountered were often exhausted and hungry. Some arrived at Allied positions seeking medical treatment. Others were brought in as prisoners of war after military installations were captured. The camps established behind the advancing Allied lines became gathering points for this enormous flow of people. Columns of prisoners were escorted through the gates. Civilians were directed toward medical tents. Doctors and medics worked continuously, examining new arrivals and determining who required immediate care. For the American medical teams stationed in these camps, the days blurred together in a steady rhythm of treatment and documentation. But occasionally a case would arrive that forced everyone in the tent to pause. A patient whose condition revealed just how severe the collapse of Germany's wartime system had become. It was during one such day in the spring of 1945 that an 18-year-old German prisoner was brought into an American medical tent, so weak she could barely stand. And within minutes, the scale would reveal a number that stunned the men examining her. Spring 1945. An American field medical station, somewhere in western Germany. The tent is already crowded. Stretchers lie along the canvas walls. Medical orderlies move quickly between patients. Outside, the distant sound of trucks and voices carries through the camp as more prisoners and civilians arrive from the collapsing front. War has trained the medics inside this tent to move efficiently. They have seen shattered bones, deep shrapnel wounds, burns from explosions. Their work normally begins with triage, identifying which injuries must be treated first and which patients can wait. But this patient is different. Two soldiers guide a young German prisoner toward the examination table. She moves slowly, her steps careful, as if even standing requires enormous effort. The loose fabric of her uniform hangs awkwardly around her body. At first glance, the medics can already see something is wrong. Her face is hollow. Her collarbones press sharply against the skin. Her wrists look impossibly thin. A doctor gestures toward the scale standing near the corner of the tent. The girl steps onto it with help. The needle swings briefly before settling into place. 61 pounds. For a moment, no one speaks. An 18-year-old human body is not meant to weigh so little. A healthy woman of that age would normally weigh more than twice that amount. The number on the scale represents not simply hunger, but the prolonged erosion of the body's basic reserves. The doctor leans closer, checking her pulse. Weak. Her breathing is shallow. The muscles of her arms and legs have largely disappeared, consumed slowly by the body as it struggled to survive without adequate nutrition. This is severe starvation, and the medics understand immediately how dangerous the situation is. When the body reaches this stage of malnutrition, the heart itself can become unstable. Internal organs begin to weaken. Even sudden access to normal food can be fatal if not carefully controlled. Treatment must begin slowly. An orderly brings water first, small amounts. Another medic prepares a light broth from the kitchen supplies nearby. The doctor instructs that food must be introduced gradually, no heavy meals. No sudden changes that could overwhelm her weakened metabolism. The girl is wrapped in blankets to conserve body heat. Severe malnutrition often leaves patients unable to regulate their temperature. Even mild cold can place additional strain on the heart. Around the tent, other patients continue receiving treatment. But several of the medics cannot stop glancing back toward the scale. The number they saw moments earlier lingers in their minds. 61 pounds. For men who had spent years treating the violent injuries of war, this moment reveals a different kind of damage. Not caused by bullets or bombs, but by the slow collapse of an entire system, the destruction of railways, the disappearance of food supplies, the exhaustion of a population that had endured years of bombing and deprivation. In the fragile body of a single teenager, the consequences of Germany's final months had become painfully visible. The war was ending. But inside this tent, the work of saving lives had only just begun. And the young prisoner lying under those blankets would soon become part of a much larger story, unfolding across the ruins of Europe. Inside Allied medical camps during the spring of 1945, survival did not always come quickly. For patients suffering from extreme starvation, recovery was a slow and uncertain process. The human body can endure long periods of hunger, but once it reaches the point of severe malnutrition, every organ begins operating under dangerous strain. Doctors knew that saving such patients required patience. The first stage of treatment focused on stabilization. Fluids were administered in careful amounts to treat dehydration. Starving patients often arrived with dangerously low blood pressure and weakened circulation. Even sitting upright for long periods could lead to dizziness or fainting. Food had to be introduced gradually. Medical teams had learned through earlier humanitarian crises that a starving body cannot immediately digest normal meals. Too much food too quickly can trigger refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal shift in the body's chemistry as it attempts to process sudden nutrients. So meals began small. Thin soups, soft bread in controlled portions, warm drinks to maintain hydration. These first steps were often spread across several days. Patients were monitored constantly. Doctors checked pulse rates, breathing patterns, and body temperature. The goal was not rapid weight gain but safe recovery. For the 18-year-old prisoner who had arrived weighing only 61 pounds, every small improvement mattered. A stronger pulse, more stable breathing, the ability to sit upright without assistance. Gradually, additional food could be added to the dietetics, small portions of meat, vegetables when available. Each new step was carefully measured to avoid overwhelming the body's weakened systems. But recovery involved more than food alone. Severe starvation affects the mind as well as the body. Prolonged hunger can cause confusion, exhaustion, and emotional distress. Many patients experienced intense fatigue even after basic nutrition returned. Medical staff often provided quiet reassurance along with treatment. Inside the tent, the atmosphere remained calm and methodical. Nurses and orderlies moved between beds, adjusting blankets, checking temperatures, and preparing meals. For American medics who had spent years treating battlefield injuries, these quieter forms of care required a different kind of attention. War had trained them to act quickly under pressure. Starvation demanded patience. Outside the medical tent, the camp continued receiving new arrivals. Prisoners of war were processed through registration areas. Refugees approached Allied lines seeking safety and food. Trucks delivered wounded soldiers from nearby battlefields. The final weeks of the war were producing enormous humanitarian challenges across Europe. Entire populations were emerging from conditions of deprivation that had remained hidden during the conflict. Allied medical teams found themselves treating civilians, prisoners, forced laborers, and concentration camp survivors, many of whom were suffering from extreme malnutrition. Each patient represented a small piece of a much larger crisis. But for the medics working inside the tent, the focus remained personal, one patient at a time. The young German prisoner who had arrived barely able to stand slowly began to regain strength under their care. Her survival would depend on days and weeks of careful treatment. And as similar cases continued appearing across Allied medical facilities in 1945, the world would begin to understand just how deeply the war had scarred the bodies of those who lived through its final months. As Allied armies continued advancing through Germany in the spring of 1945, the case of the starving teenager in the medical tent proved far from unique. Across the country, American, British, and Canadian units were encountering a humanitarian crisis that had been largely hidden during the final months of the war. Cities lay in ruins. Years of bombing had destroyed factories, rail yards, bridges, and warehouses that once formed the backbone of Germany's wartime economy. Entire districts of Berlin, Cologne, and Hamburg were reduced to fields of rubble. Millions of civilians were homeless. But the deeper problem was food. Germany's agricultural system had been stretched to its limits long before the war reached its final phase. Farms lacked workers. Fertilizer production had collapsed. Transportation networks needed to move crops into cities were crippled by bombing. When the final military collapse came in early 1945, the remaining distribution system disintegrated almost overnight. Railway schedules stopped functioning. Delivery trucks lacked fuel. Warehouses stood empty. In some regions, official rations dropped below the level required to sustain basic health. Refugees made the situation even worse. As Soviet forces advanced from the east, millions of German civilians fled westward in desperate attempts to escape the front lines. Entire families moved through snow and mud with whatever possessions they could carry. Many arrived in Western Germany already weakened by hunger. By the time Allied forces entered the country, this mass movement had created pockets of severe deprivation. Refugee camps, abandoned military installations, and overcrowded towns were filled with people who had not eaten properly for weeks or months. American medical units began documenting what they were seeing. Reports described children suffering from vitamin deficiencies, elderly civilians weakened by long-term malnutrition, and young auxiliary workers whose bodies had deteriorated during the collapse of supply systems. Doctors wrote about patients whose weight had dropped to levels rarely seen outside major humanitarian disasters. These observations would soon be echoed by other Allied units encountering survivors in different parts of Europe. When concentration camps such as Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen were liberated in April 1945, Allied medics confronted starvation on an even more horrifying scale. Thousands of prisoners inside those camps were found in advanced stages of malnutrition. The images recorded there shocked the world. But even outside the camps, the broader humanitarian consequences of the war were becoming clear. Europe had been fighting for 6 years. Agriculture had been disrupted. Cities destroyed. Populations displaced. Food systems dismantled by bombing and blockade. The starving teenager inside the American medical tent represented one small part of that larger catastrophe. She was not a concentration camp prisoner. She was a young auxiliary worker who had simply been caught inside the collapsing structure of the German war effort. Yet her condition revealed how deeply the war had penetrated into the lives of ordinary people. For the medics who treated her, the number on the scale, 61 pounds, remained a haunting reminder that the end of a war does not immediately erase the suffering it leaves behind. And as Europe slowly began the long process of rebuilding, that suffering would shape the post-war world in ways that few people inside that small medical tent could yet imagine. Wars are often remembered through their largest moments. Battles that decide the fate of nations. Armies advancing across maps. Leaders signing documents that formally end the fighting. But sometimes the true cost of war appears in far quieter places. A small medical tent. A single patient stepping onto a scale. A number that tells a story no battlefield map can show. In the spring of 1945, the collapse of Nazi Germany unfolded across thousands of cities, villages, and refugee roads. Armies surrendered. Governments vanished. The political structure that had dominated Europe for 12 years disintegrated within weeks. Yet behind those dramatic events lay millions of individual lives shaped by the same collapse. Civilians who had lost their homes. Children who had grown up under bombing raids. Young workers and auxiliaries who suddenly found themselves trapped inside a failing system with no food left to distribute. The starving 18-year-old prisoner brought into that American medical tent represented one of those lives. Her condition was not the result of a single battle or decision. It was the product of years of war-destroyed railways, collapsing farms, exhausted cities, and a government that continued fighting long after its people could no longer endure the cost. For the medics who lifted her onto the scale that day, the war momentarily stopped being an abstract struggle between nations. It became something human, a fragile body struggling to survive. The Allied armies would soon declare victory in Europe. Reconstruction would begin. Germany itself would slowly rebuild from the ruins of the Third Reich. But long after the guns fell silent, the memory of moments like this would remain. Because sometimes the reality of history is revealed not in the roar of battle, but in the quiet effort to save a single life after the fighting ends,